What is arete, anyway? It turns out that even though the entire tradition of virtue ethics uses the word virtue, arete is not best translated as the word virtue. It's actually a little more complicated than that. There really is no good translation for the concept of arete into English, although the term excellence comes the closest. So this is, of course, very counterintuitive. The whole tradition is called virtue ethics, but you're going to see that there is a connection to virtues, and that's why it's sort of okay to consider it just as virtues. But here is what you should know. A person who has achieved arete is someone who has fulfilled their virtues for his or her roles in life, whether they be intellectual, emotional, or physical. So you can see that this is a type of excellence for sure. Now it turns out that in Greek society, the realm of possibilities for what you can be is a little narrower than it is for us. But generally speaking, you can see that someone has achieved arete if they're basically excellent in all domains of their life. That's the general idea. Now in Greece, it's a little bit different, as I alluded to. In Greece, actually, it's not like you can do whatever you want. So I have here a quote, and I'm hoping this will kind of get you to see how different they were than we are, and I'll talk a little bit about it afterwards. Contrary to our own society, wherein bankers and industrialists are respected most, in classical Greek society, the philosophers, mathematicians, and artists were the leading citizens. The upper class regarded earning a living as an unfortunate necessity. Work robbed man of time and energy for intellectual activities, the duties of citizenship and discussion. These Greeks did not hesitate to express their disdain for work and business. So that alone tells you that the Greeks were very different from 21st century Americans. In any case, what is important for us here is that clearly there is an intellectual dimension and artistic to achieving arete. So if the roles that were most respected were those of, intellectuals and artists, then arete is sort of easily conceived of in terms of excellence of those people. And this is not the way society is anymore, but this is the way it was for the case study that we're going to look at now. So I wanted to give you an example of a person who was really conscious of achieving glory and excellence. That is, of course, Alexander the Great. So he is relevant to our story for multiple reasons. To go back a little bit, Alexander the Great took some academics, some intellectuals with him on campaign, and it was actually through Alexander, allegedly, that the philosopher Pyrrho was introduced to Indian philosophy, and when he went back to Greece, started a school of skepticism. So now we're back into Unit 1 for a second. But also, Alexander the Great was, of course, the pupil of Aristotle. So let's take a look at this story. In 347, shortly before his death, Plato chose his nephew over Aristotle to head the academy. Soon after, King Philip of Macedon settled Aristotle and his students at Mysa, where Aristotle began to tutor Philip's son, Alexander. So Aristotle had been Plato's student for a long time. He felt he was a shoo-in for taking over the academy, but Aristotle feels like he was a victim of nepotism, that Plato ended up choosing family member over him, so he felt a little bit slighted. So he actually, went somewhere else for a time, and right around that time period, King Philip was really into, aggrandizing his conquests, and being seen as a patron of philosophy and the arts and things like that. So he asked Aristotle to come to one of his regions, and in that time period he also Aristotle began to tutor the person would become Alexander the Great. Alexander was always fond of learning about Achilles, whom it was said was one of his ancestors. Alexander was so inspired by Achilles' story that he slept with a copy of the Iliad, personally annotated by Aristotle when he was on campaign in Asia. So clearly he was always very fond of his mythical heroes, even though he thought they were actually related to him. Also, of course, his teacher, Aristotle, always having this copy of the Iliad, or almost always. The story gets a little complicated at the end, but Aristotle's personal notes were on this copy of the Iliad, and that's what would be under his pillow when he was on campaign. At age 16, Alexander began playing a role in his father's conquests, always mindful of his level of excellence. In fact, before his father was assassinated, Alexander was worried Philip conquered too much and would leave no glory for his son. So he knew he had to prove his excellence. And the way to do that for a statesman, like he was going to become, is to conquer land. And so he was worried that his father was conquering too much land. It wouldn't give him a chance to show how excellent he is. Once his father was assassinated, of course, Alexander took over and sought to imitate the greatness of his father first, then his mythical heroes, and then even some of the gods. Of course, Alexander kept going further and further, conquering more and more land, trying to organize this land, documenting all its geographical features. Of course, as I've said, he took various scholars with him to, make new maps and kind of document the practices of the people there. So Alexander was, in the beginning, he was just trying to be like his father, but pretty soon he surpassed his father, and then he tried to be like Achilles. And then at a certain point in his campaign, he's trying to be like the gods, in particular one named Dionysus, which he was trying to go further than he went according to the myths. So he was always trying to top others, and then eventually just himself. He was just trying to be a better version of himself. Although this stress proved to be too much, that was a general idea for Alexander. So the biography that I'm taking this from is Alexander the Great, The Invisible Enemy by John Maxwell O'Brien. And an interesting part of this biography is that O'Brien stresses actually the role of alcohol in Alexander's life. That is the invisible enemy. So this is a bit of a, they call this sometimes revisionist history, but it has received a lot of praise for being a very accurate portrayal of what Alexander might have been really like, and when basically the point where alcoholism got the better of Alexander. And in case, this is where I got all my information from. With that said, and with the story of Alexander, kind of in your mind, you can kind of imagine how, for some Greeks, arete was really an obsession. And I can think, of no better example of this than Alexander. So now we have to ask ourselves, okay, let's suppose that we do want to achieve arete. We want to flourish, right? Eudaimonia. So what set of virtues should we practice? In other words, who is a virtuous person? Well, this is where the story gets a little complicated, because there's actually various competing models of virtue. So let's begin with the work of Aristotle. Of course, Aristotle popularized this approach to ethics. He didn't quite conceive of it, or at least not single-handedly. Of course, Plato, Aristotle's teacher, also emphasized virtues, so it isn't entirely new to Aristotle, but he definitely popularized the view. So it should be stressed from the beginning that not only did he not invent it, but his set of virtues, it really is the kind of virtues that you would teach someone who is an aristocrat in training. Let's just say someone who is going to be Alexander the Great. So there really is kind of an aristocratic bent to Aristotle's set of virtues. When you see them, you'll realize, oh, these might be good for maybe a modern day politician. Well, not all of them, but some of them, right? So, okay. The way that Aristotle arrived at his set of virtues, as he took a bunch of character traits that were for sure vices. They weren't good, and he organized them, and he found the mean between them, the middle part. You want to call it the golden mean. So, for example, between cowardice and rashness, there is a virtue. So if you're a coward, you are afraid of everything, you're not willing to do things because you're afraid. That's not okay. If you're rash, however, you almost have too much confidence. You put yourself in risky situations that you really have no business taking part in. So if you find the middle ground between cowardice and rashness, that's a virtue. That's the virtue of courage. And that's how Aristotle finds the virtues that one is supposed to develop. So let's look at the next one, temperance. So if you are, let's refer to wine. The Greeks loved their wine. Typically, you would cut the wine. You would dilute the wine with some water. So if you didn't do this, you were considered self-indulgent. You wanted to get drunk, and you couldn't help yourself. However, the Greeks kind of looked down on people who didn't drink any wine. It was just not within their set of norms, and they found something wrong about that. Maybe slightly antisocial. There was different explanations about why they looked down on it. But in other words, you really are supposed to indulge a little bit, but not too much. That's temperance, and of course, that's a virtue. So charity is a pretty straightforward one. You shouldn't waste all your money, that is, be prodigal. But you also shouldn't be so stingy that you never spend any of it on your friends or on events or what have you. So charity is a good middle ground. Proper self-value and proper ambition are related. And I kind of like that this is included in Aristotle's set of virtues. You need to not be vain. That's having too much self-value. But you also shouldn't devalue yourself. You need to make sure that you respect yourself as you are, but also have a realistic appraisal of the kind of person that you are. So it's proper self-value. Similarly, you need a proper degree of ambition. You can't have too much, that would be greed. But you also need a little bit of ambition, otherwise you're never going to work towards anything. You can't be apathetic, in other words. Okay, so good temper, obviously you need to get mad sometimes. There are some things that you should rightfully get mad at, but you can't always be mad like the Incredible Hulk or something. Okay. Truthfulness, of course, this makes sense. How you represent yourself must be truthful. You can't be boasting. That's, of course, stretching the truth. And you can't have mock modesty either. So humble bragging is something that Aristotle warns against. I think this one's interesting. Aristotle thinks you should be witty. So you can't be boring. That's bad. You also can't be a clown. You have to have the right amount of humor to you. And I actually agree. So that's really interesting that Aristotle found it fit to include this in a set of virtues. And just one more, you should be modest. That one's pretty clear. So as you can see, if you were to recommend this set of virtues to a politician, it sort of makes perfect sense. Like, yeah, you should work on all these things. So of course, Aristotle, being the tutor of Alexander, might have even been working on these ideas while he was tutoring Alexander. It wasn't written down until much later, but it's possible, at least, that Alexander had as much of an effect on Aristotle as Aristotle did on Alexander. One more thing I should mention about Aristotle's virtue ethics is that it really is a difficult mean to achieve. So up in the top, we have the behaviors. I guess on the x coordinate, we have the behaviors here. And they could be, a range of behaviors, intellectual behaviors, physical feats, what have you. But the idea here is you have to get the average, the mean of the deficiency and the excess with regards to behaviors. But at the same time, the Greeks felt that emotions were separate from the intellect. So they stressed that you had to train your emotions too. You had to train your emotions to let your behaviors occur in the way that you've decided needs to be the case, in the way that reason dictates. So you not only have to reach a mean as far as your behaviors go, but also a mean with regards to your emotions. Really control them and train them. And that's really hard. Just achieving one dimension of this graph is difficult. Achieving both requires that you get just that perfect location, that Goldilocks region, and that's really challenging. And obviously, even Alexander the Great, who is considered, they call him the Great, it's not clear that he was able to reach this despite all his work. Of course, he ended up devolving into alcoholism. So, it really, the point of Alexander's story, at least the reason why I'm telling it, is to tell you that reaching Arete is difficult. It's challenging. It requires lifelong practice. So that's something that I need to stress. Okay, let's move on to another theory of virtue. So Virginia Held is moving along with the virtue tradition. She likes virtue ethics in general, but she basically thinks they're too much about just not harming others, or they're too aristocratic, in other words. So she develops the ethics of care. So let me take this from the slides. The ethics of care is a 20th century movement that sought to shift virtue ethics away from Aristotelian virtues that saw the culmination of eudaimonia in aristocratic ideals towards more interpersonal virtues with a focus on how we can care for each other. So when we think about ethics, we do think about, at least a little bit, compassion and caring for others. And Aristotle's set of virtues, it's not clear that that's the main thrust that they're stressing. So Virginia Held didn't want to supplant or replace Aristotelian virtues. She wanted to expand them and add to them. So here is just a little subset of Aristotle's virtues, and Virginia Held wanted just to add a couple of things to it. Sure, courage is good. How about compassion too? Temperance, great. Well, we also have to be able to understand ourselves. When we do self-indulge, which happens, we need a little self-understanding to get back on the horse and keep trying. Charity, of course, very important. But you also have to give conscientiously, right? It can't just be give to anyone. Give to someone who is going to make a difference, or to someone in whom you can make a difference. So you have to worry about those things too. Proper self-value, again, proper ambition. How about proper self-love and proper values? So again, Held is just expanding the list of virtues we should develop. If anything, that actually makes it harder, right? It was hard enough just with Aristotle's virtues, even for Alexander. Imagine all these things as well. The main difference between Aristotle and Held is that Held emphasizes not just not harming others, but actively helping others and building strong interpersonal relationships, which can be challenging. So again, Held wants to stress that you have to actually help others, not just not harm them. And again, this, if anything, makes the whole development of arete even more challenging. So now we're moving into accounts of virtue that aren't as mainstream. Certainly, virtue ethics of the Aristotelian type and Virginia Held's ethics of care, those are pretty clearly within the virtue ethics tradition. But not everyone agrees that Buddhism can be seen as a form of virtue ethics. I won't weigh in on this here. I'll just tell you that at least some people do think that Buddhism is a form of virtue ethics. In particular, Matt Lawrence, who wrote several books on the philosophy of the matrix. That's kind of his call to fame. So he thinks Buddhism can be conceived of within the virtue tradition. So let me just give you a couple of Buddha virtues. So compassion, generosity, integrity, those seem pretty straightforward, and I'm sure Virginia Held would include them in her version, her expanded version of Aristotle's virtues. But let's look at this fourth one, renunciation. That is very, very Buddhist. You're giving up excess desire. So the whole idea behind Buddhism is to essentially rid yourself of any desires that are ultimately only harming you, because they're making you always crave, always be attached to something. And the whole idea behind Buddhism is that you will eventually rid yourself of these cravings so that you can finally be at peace. So renunciation is key here. And now you're seeing that renunciation is definitely incompatible with something like Aristotelian virtue ethics. I mean, just imagine trying to teach Alexander renunciation. It's not clear that that would have even made sense to him. So that's very interesting. So already we see some tension here between this set of virtues and that of Aristotle's. Wisdom, sure, that's pretty intuitive. Sympathetic joy is an interesting one, very Buddhist as well. The antidote to envy. So sometimes people have kind of a passive-aggressive envy about them. You might be doing really well and you tell your friend about this and they're envious and they say something like, "Ooh, that must be nice, for you," in a kind of, a passive-aggressive way. What you really should aim to develop, according to Buddhism, is sympathetic joy. You need to be happy for others when they're doing well. And that really is difficult. And again, I'm not entirely sure that this would have made sense to Alexander. So more clashing going on here. Effort, of course, patience, truthfulness, resolution, those, I think Alexander would be okay with. Aristotle, of course. How about these last two? Loving kindness. Well, that's kind of an extension of sympathetic joy. Equanimity or evenness of mind. That is when you finally achieved this balance. Even if you still have desires, you feel like you're in control of them. And then you achieve this evenness of mind. So again, that is not exactly what Aristotle was going for at anywhere in his set of virtues. So this is very, very Buddhist. And although this one doesn't clash so much with Aristotle's ethics, Aristotle certainly didn't stress anything like this. So again, this is a whole other conception of what flourishing or eudaimonia is. For Buddhism, flourishing is enlightenment. So this is very different from Aristotle's set of virtues. And we have to ask ourselves, well, which one are we supposed to go for? Enlightenment or to be an aristocrat? I don't know. In any case, here's how we can wrap up the Buddha virtues section. These are very, very difficult. Some people spend their entire lives meditating and following the Eightfold Path and never really getting to enlightenment. So, in other words, I hope you're getting this. Virtue ethics is challenging. Very, very challenging. Okay, one more. So, again, this one is not a mainstream view. That is to say, that it's not typically conceived of as being within the virtue ethics tradition, but at least some people do think that Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy is best understood within the virtue ethics tradition. So, linked to our page is a recent paper by Randy Firestone. I should divulge that he is both a friend and a colleague, but Randy Firestone conceives of Nietzsche's philosophy as just another version of virtue ethics, and it does actually line up somewhat with Aristotle's, not completely, but it is yet another version, according to Randy Firestone, of virtue ethics. So that is another one for you to think about. Of course, virtue ethics has many faces, and that in itself poses a challenge to the view, which is the right set of virtue ethics, right? So more on that in the rest of the lesson.